Yes.
Alderman Astor.
Yes.
Mayor Outlaw.
Yes.
Alderman Kinsey.
Yes.
Alderman Best.
Yes.
Alderman Odom.
Yes.
Motion carries. Item number 7.
Thank you, Mayor. Item number 7 is an update on the Stanley White Recreation Center. We have some folks here that are going to give us an update on that. As you recall, the city contracted with MBF Architects to review and evaluate city-owned buildings that were substantially damaged during Hurricane Florence. The evaluation for Stanley White Recreation Center has been completed. Mr. Eure, who is the architect with MBF Architects, is here. He's going to discuss the results of the damage restoration evaluation, a copy of which is provided in your packet. There's a brief memo in there also from Mr. Hughes, Director of Parks and Recreation. So at this point, if this is pleasurable with the board, then I'll turn it over to Mr. Eure and let him present it to you.
Mr. Mayor, members of the board, good evening. Thank you for having us. As you already know, and has been an overview given, we have been engaged by the city to aid in the Hurricane Florence disaster recovery assessment. That work covered several buildings, but tonight I'm here to report on the Stanley White Recreation Center, which is the largest and most heavily impacted, at least in terms of a financial point of view. Essentially, we were asked to evaluate 3 probable costs for that facility, the first of which would be a cost to repair it to make it usable as is, the second being a cost to demolish the building, and the third being a cost to replace the building. And obviously the demolish cost and the replace cost would go together. I'm just going to cut to the chase. The estimate of probable cost to demolish the building is about $1.5 million. In your agenda packets, you'll have our full report, which has a detailed accounting arriving at that number. The estimated cost for demolition is about $630,000. And then lastly, the estimated cost for replacement is about just shy of $7.4 million. All of these estimates have been compiled in a manner that is of an appropriate format for FEMA, and so that also influenced some of the outcomes. We did take opportunities to adjust our unit prices to attempt to account for local conditions. Obviously, all of us who were affected by the storm and are trying to make repairs, we've noticed that tradespeople are very hard to locate. And then once you locate them, they cost more than you had anticipated. And so those kinds of adjustments have been built into these numbers. Yes, ma'am.
You said the $1.5 million is for the demolition, or
For the repair of the center as it is now.
It would cost $1.5 million to repair it as is.
Correct. And when I say as is, when we run our figures for the replacement building, we are accounting for code compliance and elevating the building above base flood elevation. So the Stanley White Recreation Center was built about 1972, 73, as memory serves. At that time, it was compliant, but of course we now have new flood elevations, and if we were to replace that building, we'd want to elevate it.
And that's included in the 1.5?
Now, that's the difference. In other words, when I say to repair Stanley White as is, it is still below flood elevation. And it still remains a risk, in my opinion, in terms of a future event.
Okay.
And I guess insurance or FEMA would not cover the 1.5, is that correct?
I do not think so. And to, again, we are working very closely with your consultant, Disaster Recovery Services. And so the repair estimate had more to do with the fact that you had 2 insurance policies covering the structure, one of which you got full payment on, as I recall, the other of which was somewhat substantially below, I will say, the other insurer. And so between those two, we demonstrated without a doubt that the building is substantially damaged as defined by FEMA. And then also we identified a number of shortcomings that raise that lower insurance estimate to a point where you'd get full value for your policy.
So, Tripp, by So the public will know, substantially damaged buildings means that it cannot be repaired because it cannot meet the current code. Is that correct?
That is FEMA terminology for when you're seeking funding from FEMA to help take care of those damages. Something that's substantially damaged, cannot be reused once those funds come into play. And I'm hoping Corey Spalding is coming up right here beside me because he is your consultant from the Disaster Recovery Services, and without a doubt, he could explain that much better than I. But I think I've roughly got that right.
The purpose behind
Can you come to the mic?
the purpose behind them doing the exercise for the repairs to the building was there was conflicts between the two insurance companies, and the National Flood Insurance Program did up an estimate that was severely lacking in many areas, and so therefore to receive the policy limit under them, this work product was put together to demonstrate what the repair costs were. The building cannot be repaired because it is below the base flood elevation. Hence, the cost to replace it was also put together by them. Did that answer your question?
Is this the replacement in that's to replace it and rebuild in that same location cost?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And the 7.4 million, that's FEMA? That would be FEMA money, or are you saying this is the two insurance companies combined together?
So the $7.4 million is our estimated cost to replace the building.
Mm-hmm.
Where the funding comes from is more of a policy decision.
Have we received any?
Decision.
Yeah, that's the 428. That's what we're applying.
Yeah, so essentially that's why you've got this guy.
The $7.4 million estimate that he put together was submitted to FEMA, and on last Thursday, I believe it was the 23rd, I received an email from the FEMA program delivery manager that said that she had taken that work product and sent it off to their FEMA's special teams unit to do an analysis of it, to work towards determining the FEMA eligibility and the FEMA dollars that are eligible for that project. So it's a work in progress at this point in time with the, and I will say, the excellent work product that was put together by them.
McKenzie, if you have a question.
Yes. The current elevation now, what is that? The current elevation?
The building has two finished floor elevations. Okay, the lowest of which, whereby you classify the whole building, is at 6 feet. Now.
What-
Okay, we have to be at about 10 feet to be above base flood elevation, so we're 4 feet too low.
Okay. So what about the surrounding properties once that elevation takes place? Would that have any effect on runoff on anyone else in the area?
It will not, and we've been very careful to elevate simply the footprint of the building, as well as we've elevated part of the parking lot. So I'm going to go through some numbers. I hope I don't confuse you, but if we elevate just the footprint of the building around the edges about 4 feet, we've introduced a number of ramps and steps so it's handicap accessible. To help minimize that differential, the parking immediately adjacent to the building, there are two areas of that parking lot, and you can visually see that in the reporting that we have in your packet. The upper level we'd raise about 2 feet to help minimize the total distance, and then we'd leave the remaining bay of parking at the 6 foot elevation. Okay, and the reason I say it's not going to impact any of the adjoining properties is because the impervious area is the same. We're just manipulating the heights to get the best accessibility we can to meet codes and requirements.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tripp, I may be getting ahead of it. You have also had an engineer to look at the ground, doing maybe core samples or whatever it is you guys do to make sure that the ground is suitable for rebuilding a building out there?
We have talked about that. We have not done any borings, but we have a suspicion, and you will find this in our report underneath the replacement discussion, that a great deal of masonry stress fractures were seen in the building during our observations. And many of you know that our office renovated Stanley White Recreation Center around 2010. Any types of deficiencies like that were repaired at the time, but it's our opinion that there are more numerous instances and that those cracks, those stress cracks, are larger than what we saw for the first 40 years of service of that building at the time we renovated. Our thought is, and this is just based on experience, generally speaking, lower lying areas have a lot of clay in the soil. And for those of you who aren't familiar with construction, clay is not conducive to supporting buildings because it expands and contracts when it gets wet, depending on its amount of moisture content. Obviously, when you flood a site like the Stanley White Recreation Center, if we were to take borings, we expect to find a soil with a very high degree of clay content. And our theory is, when flooded, that soil got saturated and it expanded. And when it expanded, it amplified differential settlement underneath the building, causing those cracks. Now that the floodwaters have receded, the soils have naturally migrated to their natural content, moisture content. The building's back down where it was. So part of that replacement cost estimate, that $7.4 million, is we anticipate that driven pilings, probably wood pilings, would be necessary. But as you point out, Alderman Astor, we need to do some borings to confirm these things, these theories.
So what is your expert opinion on putting a building there with the information you just shared with us, and 10 years or 20 years to go with that? That used to be a trash pile when I was a kid. It was a dump site.
Right.
It was a very poor site of land then.
Mm-hmm.
So from what you just shared with us, it's a possibility anything could be going on underground.
First of all, I have to issue the disclaimer that I'm not a geotechnical engineer, and those are the folks who would perform the borings and then give us a bearing pressure.
Mm-hmm.
But short of that, I would say I'm very optimistic that pilings could overcome a number of conditions like that. Obviously, I don't know what the details are at this point, and I can't conclusively say there's not a situation that might preclude us from rebuilding on that site. But given relatively normal circumstances, pilings would take care of that problem.
Just trying to get all the information
Sure.
that I can get as a person to share based on what I know about the land itself.
Right. And we've heard similar rumors, about the condition of the subsurface soils.
Okay.
Alderman Odom.
Tripp, your $7.4 million estimate, that is to provide a comparable building, obviously new materials, but a building with the same functionality that the existing building has, correct? So it's not bigger, it's not better, it's exactly like it was, just in today's modern day cost.
That's correct. The only exception is we would be code compliant in a number of instances that we are not now.
Thank you.
And this may be a question for Corey, I'm not sure, or even the city manager, but has the insurance company paid the city yet for the damages of that building? Or JR, or whoever could answer that one?
We just went over that this morning. As a matter of fact, your NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program carrier, has paid $346,000 out of $500,000. Your insurance agent, Jess Quinn, in conjunction with us, just submitted a package to the adjusting firm that handles that claim, and we provided them with the documentation that they asked for, which included the repair estimate that Tripp had performed. So we anticipate that a supplemental payment up to the $500,000 policy limit will be coming from there. But to answer your question, under that policy, you receive $350,000, somewhere in that area there. Under your main insurance policy, you have received a $250,000 advance And
Advance.
was the 300,000 received?
No,
JR?
we've not received that yet.
We've been told that an additional $300,000 advance has been asked for by the insurance company, and then also we've been informed that another $600,000 advance has been requested from the insurance company for a combination of wind and flood damages, not necessarily just the Stanley White Center. And there was a meeting on Thursday to discuss many issues involving the insurance claim. It's an ongoing process, and so they have advanced monies, and there are some issues, but I will state that based upon everything that we've seen, we see no reason that you will not receive the full $1 million policy limits under the flood insurance policy that you have for there, plus your wind damages. Did that answer your question, sir?
It did. They're just slow paying it out. I mean, what has it been, 8 months now?
The flurry of emails and the frustration has been beyond what would be expected, and we think it's going to culminate Thursday. I've shared a bunch of information with JR that we've talked about how they're working to settle the claim, and the frustrating part is that we feel that this should be a no-brainer, that they should have just paid the policy limits by now. It's obviously that they're going to have to, plus the wind damages, and we don't know why they haven't. So we're working to get.
So you feel comfortable that they're going to pay the claim fairly quick now that you've provided them with the information?
I won't go on the record for that one. This
I-
has been very frustrating. This has
I
dragged
think-
on for like 3 months now. We've been going back and forth asking for information as to why, and haven't been able to get an answer as to why they haven't issued a payment.
I think if we don't receive payment, Mr. Stevens, if we don't receive payment soon, I think a nice letter from the city manager or either the city attorney wanting to know when
I
would be
was
appropriate.
Literally was just discussing that with Scott, that if it's necessary, we'll have a very strongly worded message
Sure.
to them that we're getting ready to pursue legal action if we don't, because we have proven beyond a shadow of my doubt, and probably y'all's as well, that the damages sustained have been far greater than what the policy limits are.
Well,
So,
even their
I'll be
adjusters
happy to
agree,
sit in
right?
that meeting on Thursday if I need to.
Well, I mean, months ago, and I'm saying at least 4 or 5 months ago, we submitted a claim package for the flood end of your policy that went, I believe it was at $3 to $3.5 million. That was, and it didn't include obviously all of your losses or damages. It was just a document that the damages were far in excess of your $1 million policy limits, hoping to stimulate a payment from them with that demonstration. And since that submittal, we've gotten a promise of a further advance that hasn't come forward, and no comment on the submittal.
This is my concern. This has nothing to do with Stanley White, but we're approaching hurricane season again, and it's time for us to start getting some of this money back in so we can be prepared if this was, God forbid, if this was to happen again.
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, ma'am.
I have more of a comment. I think I was trying to understand what Alderman Odom was saying in regards to with the $7.4 million, that if we rebuild it there, we're basically probably going to get the same style structure and nothing really new except for that it was elevated. Am I understanding that you were getting, okay. So I think it would be a great idea for us as a board to direct the staff to maybe have someone come out and possibly look at the Days Inn location or another location to actually draw up some ideas, because I would not want $7.4 million to go back to Stanley White and it look and be what it is, when that's a lot of money, when we can give that community more amenities and a bigger facility, a state-of-the-art facility. That's how I feel, but I want to hear from my constituents, but I feel like at this point we have some money, especially if we have an advance on this insurance, to go ahead and get some drawings rendered from different locations. I think Days Inn is a perfect location, or the old over by the George Street. I know that was brought up to kind of map out and kind of show, like how we did with Kidsville and Martin Marietta, to kind of get the the citizens involved and to say, okay, they hear this update, this is what you can get at Stanley White in this current location, and this is what you can get these other options, so that we can kind of move, especially if we have some money and we don't have to worry about this old site, we can start building and construction and doing what we need to do for another site if that's what people agree on and we vote on that.
We would guarantee, though, that, the only way I would do that is if we guarantee that it would always be called Stanley White
Right,
Recreation
yes, I
Center.
agree with that,
I
too.
think that's the important note here, is that it celebrates the life of someone very important in the community. And as long as we would all agree on that, that would help me in my decision.
Because, based on the research, it sounds like we're going to have some issues with the ground. It just seems like it's going to be something on top of another, and we're investing all this money, and this community deserves to have something state of the art, and they deserve a lot for $7.4 million. So I just think if we can all get on one accord, show of hands or something, where we can kind of start that process so the citizens know that we haven't forgotten them, that we still care about Stanley White, but they need to understand that this is option A of going back to Stanley White, or B and C, so that we can kind of, get the community involved. I think that's something we should do.
Alderman Best.
Yeah, well, now I know $7.4 million, that's a lot of money, but Alderman Harris, we've already heard from the public, and they're very adamant about wanting Stanley White to remain in the location where it sits.
But we have new
But-
updated information, though.
I know, so in order for me to justify coming here tonight with a $7.4 million figure here, and that does not include that there's probably going to be problems, as you're saying, there may be problems with the land, I think that should have been taken into consideration before this figure was put before us. If you're telling me, I'm hearing you correctly, there's going to maybe possible problems with the land.
I think you're hearing me correctly, but let me help refocus the conversation. What gets done with the money is a policy decision by this board. You've hired us right now to estimate a replacement building that fits the definition of what FEMA evaluates, which is the exact same building on the exact same site. And so part of the 428 program, that's what they will potentially reimburse. I think once you get the money, you will go through a public process that's already started to some degree with the public in terms of these are our options for rebuilding going forward. And it may very well be a different site that you choose. But at least within the constraints of this study, don't confuse us as saying this is what you need to do.
Oh, no,
Tripp,
no,
the
no,
local
no.
expert, says you need to rebuild it where it is. We're simply just trying to maximize the benefit that you can leverage out of FEMA so that we may not get the whole $7.4 million, but whatever comes of it, then you'll go through that process of determining a better Stanley White that may look different. Certainly will. It's a 45-year-old building. It will look newer, obviously.
Just to add to Mr. Eure, I think, and he's stated it very eloquently, and I think the policy decision that the board needs to make in this matter takes into account the public's input, but you also need to take into account the build back better and more resilient, and what this community as a whole and the community within the Duffy Field area and the Five Points area needs. If you build, and I'm just thinking back to this hurricane, you remember we operated West Newbern Recreation Center as a shelter for about 2 months at least afterwards. And what his proposal does not change is the ground elevation entirely around Stanley White Recreation exists at about 4.5, correct?
A low point.
So one thing to consider is if you ever wish to use Stanley White Recreation Center as a potential other shelter for our community, you sure don't want to be delivering people to that shelter while it may be built at elevation 11 based on new standards. You're going to be delivering them in boats. So when you talk about building back better, building back more resilient, and thinking about the fact of whether or not you want to build back a community center Recreation Center that could potentially be used for other uses during hurricane preparedness. And Mayor, I think you and I heard up there at DC about City of Wilmington. They are sitting here discussing, what if we get a Category 3, Category 4, Category 5 hurricane? We don't have any shelters that can withstand that. Potentially, there could be grant funds out there that we could potentially match with this money that we could get through the mitigation process, and maybe get us a shelter that might be able to withstand worse storms and built at a higher, better location. So those are all policy decisions that the board needs to consider. We can go back where it was, build it back as Mr. Eure has presented to it, and we know kind of what that cost is going to be now. The question is that the policy decision that the board wishes to make? Do we want to move forward with something different at a different location but within the community? Do we want to add to it? What do we want to do? That's the things. Right now, he is simply bringing together the facts so that we have already submitted to FEMA through the mitigation process. Now it's in their hands to evaluate the validity of his evaluation versus what the insurance companies and the replacement costs are. And then at that point, hopefully we'll get a positive response from them. And when we do so, then we kind of have some decisions we've got to make.
So you're saying ultimately we need to wait until we got a correct dollar amount before we go out in the community and give different options in different locations?
I think that would be a very appropriate action. Yes, ma'am.
Did staff find out about the grant that we did, the $1 million remodel job back in 2010? How does that impact?
We are required by the part of grant that we receive to continue to offer the same services that grant required during the operation. So whatever we wrote in that for
At the same
period.
location or an alternative location?
It can be in an alternative location. We can get an approval to move it to an alternative location. It has to be approved through them, but that's very simple things. It's basically providing the same service in the same square footage. Correct me if I'm wrong, Foster, is that correct? But that is basically what they're requiring. And that's for a period of...
an extraction on the difference of in an average subsoil condition area versus a marginal area. Did you do an extraction of what the value engineered cost difference would be between one location versus the other?
We do have that cost estimate. It's in the line items in your report. I apologize, I don't have that exact number, but I can give you an estimate.
Well, I mean, that would be a consideration of
Yeah.
substitution as
So essentially, we'd already mentioned the pilings earlier, and again, these are all part of included within the $7.4 million. We'd also anticipate a series of grade beams, which are concrete beams that support the floor, that are then supported by the pilings, and that's essentially, if you think of that as a bridge, that's how you bridge over a marginal soil that has a tendency to move around. The way pilings work is the longer you make the piling, the more friction it has, the more it can hold up. So generally speaking, it's just a question of how long and how close together do those piles need to be, which is also an estimate included in the report. And I would say that's roughly $250,000 expenditure above what a typical shallow foundation system would be that most of us are fairly familiar with.
And obviously, that being a one-story building versus a 4 or 5-story, the weight of the building and the repetitive member value of the system would vary from the 250 to 500 or whatever.
So that's one of the few things about this cost estimate that gives me a lot of confidence that you could at least replace what is currently on site at the same site, is because a one-story building is very forgiving.
Yeah.
Multiple story buildings, way more for each story, more possibility for movement, and the more critical it becomes to have very well-defined geotechnical information to make a recommendation for costs of the foundation system.
So for the way that the building, you would not do a monolithic map type system, you would actually go with pilings and then...
And a series of grade beams with the slab itself, in lieu of a 4-inch slab, may end up being a 6-inch slab, depending upon the reinforcement that might need to be placed in there. So I can only tell you this with some certainty is because we've essentially done the same thing at Craven Community College for their business and technology building, which is a 2-story building.
Over here.
Yeah, I just, basically my last comment is that I want to do whatever the citizens want to do, but I just want to make sure that they understand each option and that they understand, the validity of what you're saying. It's not directed towards you, I'm just in general, that they understand the possibilities of things that can happen in the past, and when you have a certain amount of money and have the ability to build something bigger and better in the same area that's going to still benefit them, I want them to know their options, because before they didn't have and now they do. So that's just basically my main concern, and I just want to continue to make sure that we're on a process that it's not going to be 4 to 5 years before this community center is built back or built better in another location.
In putting all of these costs together, we did an analysis of potential things. Short of going out and doing test borings on the ground, the engineering firm took into certain variables that may be encountered, which is necessary to come up with what the estimated replacement cost would be, and those, as he said, have already been calculated into it. We have attempted, the majority of your funding is going to come from FEMA on this building, and we've attempted to structure that request for reimbursement of funding to give you the maximum flexibility to do whatever that you would like with that final dollar value when it comes out, whether it comes out at 7.4 or 7 or 6.5, whatever it finally ends up at. You will have you'll hopefully have the flexibility to do whatever you would like with the money. If that means rebuilding back at Stanley White exactly the same, if it means building back a modified Stanley White to better serve the community in the needs that you want, if it involves moving it someplace else or a combination thereof, those are all flexibility issues, and I would expect that once we find out a more firmer dollar value, that those would be the discussions that you would probably have.
I think the $7 million question is, if that building was built in the 72 to 75 period, if and when the next big one comes, if it's 20 years from now, 30 years from now, and we spent $7 million there, or we spent $7 million in a 12-foot elevation area, as an architect, and you can't determine exactly, but obviously the integrity would be compromised if you triple reinforce that system you're talking with an inundation of 5 feet of water standing there for 24 hours, that system would be potentially compromised versus a comparable Stanley White somewhere that it did not have 5 feet of water on it. Would that be a reasonable statement?
Well, I believe so.
So there's your $7 million question.
Well, the one thing that I like about it and hadn't even really thought of is the fact that if we build it back in the same location and put it back with pilings, the city manager pointed out that it will be an island. I mean, the rest of the community and the roadway and everything else is going to be under 3 or 4 foot of water. So we couldn't utilize it as a shelter. So my recommendation, whether we put it in this current location or whether we move it, I would recommend that the architect contact the Red Cross and get what specifications they require for it to be a shelter. Because there's very few buildings around here that can qualify as a shelter. So, and I do know that they have a list of specifications of what they require. So we might want to even start thinking about it, and see what it's going to take if we build it back as a shelter. Even if we build it in the same location, it probably would be a good place to have a shelter.
It would be a recreation center, but you're saying the shelter would be the second component, correct?
Well, you have to build the building. I mean, shelters are schools now, so most of we had a shelter in the West New Bern Center, but it wasn't during the hurricane. Mm-hmm. It was after the hurricane, so you really don't have to meet the specifications, storm specifications. What I'm saying is, if we're thinking about building a building back, it should meet the storm specifications. So the Red Cross can operate it as a shelter.
To put it a different way, there's a reason why, if the schools are being used and our recreation centers are being used as shelters, there's a reason why J.T. Barber, Oaks Road, and Stanley White Recreation Center aren't used as shelters.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which kind of gets to the heart of the matter, that I don't think, for the welfare of our citizens, if this thing had not been a 10.5-foot storm surge in a Category 1 and had been a 3-foot storm surge in a Category 4, unless you had about a 200-mile-an-hour wind zone, you could have had a lot of residents, their life would be in extreme jeopardy.
Absolutely.
If they were inside that unit and it went from what we thought was a 1 and went to a 4, which we thought it was going to be a 3 or a 4. So,
Hence the reason why we, for mandatory evacuation to like Raleigh and places
for
like that.
hurricane purposes, what is the recommended? Is it about 200 mile an hour? I'm not up on that, so
Well,
obviously 140 would be probably the wind load in that area, but
There
for
are-
hurricane resiliency, it's probably 200 or something.
There are multiple standards. Simply from a building code point of view, which is what I'm most familiar and the place that I would suggest we start, I think you're looking at type 3 risk factor building, which essentially has a robust enhanced structure. And that is a different way of saying that it's got a better capacity to resist a higher wind load. At some point, you face a challenge if you want to design for a Category 4 or 5 storm, because essentially, you're building the equivalent of a bomb shelter as opposed to a recreation center, and those are opposing uses. So we have to find a happy balance between.
Well, I don't think as a city we're going to want the citizens to, even if we have 300 mile an hour wind load,
Yeah.
we want them west of I-95. We want a mandatory evacuation.
That's right.
And we don't want them sitting around in a 200 or 300 mile per hour wind.
Sure. But to achieve those higher wind level resistance ratings, you essentially have to eliminate openings, windows
well,
and doors.
also overhang.
And overhangs.
Right, so I don't want to compromise the beauty and the enhancements of the building if we're
Of course
focused
not.
on a bomb shelter or a regular shelter. I mean,
And I just share that as a silly response
no,
to
I'm
a
just saying that
large
was, I'm
storm.
just conversation with
Yeah.
the board to say, we want Stanley White to be a recreation center. I mean, I understand we want to be able to have shelter, especially in that community, but I just don't want it to look like.
Well, you don't, and we're
Way
way
ahead
too
of the
early
game.
and way too ahead. But you don't have to build the whole building like that.
Yeah.
You can build the gymnasium or something like that to accommodate those type of things. But we're still, this discussion can take place a little later on when we start doing a design and discussion.
Well, in other words, are we in anticipation of about 3 to 6 months hearing back? We're not going to hear back in 2 weeks, I wouldn't think.
It won't be 2 weeks.
Is this the
Well,
time for
I'm
us
on
to
a
start
crystal
calling
ball
our
about
people?
3 to 6 months.
I was actually going to bring that up and say I don't have my crystal ball with me here today, but the state of North Carolina is very aggressive here in working with FEMA to try to push these things through. Alderman Esther there has been in contact with them quite regularly about moving the projects forward, and we're hoping that the time frame will be shorter than 6 months, and we plan on staying on top of it to try to push it forward.
Okay, I think as a board, when we get that magic number, I'm sure time will be of the essence to move
Yes.
forward with an improvement somewhere, if it be there. But I know that the board, I think I speak for the board, that we want the permanent name to remain
Stanley White.
the Stanley White
Absolutely.
Recreation Center in honor of Stanley White.
Is there anything else on the Stanley Center, Corey, that any other progress or anything else that you need to talk to us about the Stanley Center?
No, other than that all the paperwork has been submitted, and they're reviewing it, I guess, would be the appropriate term.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
For the presentation.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Tripp.
It's time, Mr. Steve, let's go to number 8.
Thank you, Mayor. Item number 8 is consideration of the board adopting an ordinance amendment changing the city's election method from